What in the heck was that? Okay. Looks like we're gonna end this video on a bighorn. Alright, well never mind. The bighorn spooked while they were on the other side of the mountain from me. So that's one of the big problems with this game. It's the animals don't really have hearing, they have radar. You know, if you take a lot of people compare this game to the Hunter Classic. And one of the big things with the Hunter Classic is how sensitive the animals are. The thing is, if you go in there and you measure it, you know, if you walk towards an animal and you write down the distance at which it takes notice of you, the animals in the Hunter Classic aren't that sensitive. And actually, in many ways, between Call of the Wild, Way of the Hunter, and Classic actually, in some metrics, is the easiest game, but yet it's still regarded as being the most realistic. So let's do a few direct comparisons here. So let's say you're running at an animal. Let's say compare running at an animal and how animals respond to players running in the Way of the Hunter and in Classic. In the Way of the Hunter, that they're going to take notice of you somewhere between 200 and 260 meters. Maybe you can get down to 180. And that's pretty similar to the Hunter Classic. The Hunter Classic used to, they would run away as soon as they popped into render, which used to be 220 meters, now is 320. But used to, they'd be spooking somewhere in the neighborhood of 180 to 200 meters, and now sometimes you'll see it out to 240 or 260. Now, let's slow down to just walking. In Way of the Hunter, if I just walk at a herd of elk, and we saw it happened to me just today when I was hunting the elk that I shot with a bow. I got a warning call from them at 170 meters. And they would have, if I had continued walking, they would have spooked shortly after that. I wouldn't have been able to get closer than 160 from them. In the Hunter Classic, the gap from running to just walking is enough to get you inside of 80 meters. You know, it can spook animals out to 100 or 120, but usually that's combined with another sense, which you don't have in Way of the Hunter, and I'll talk about that a little more in just a minute. But what seems to happen with Way of the Hunter is they just, and what I'm going to be getting at here is that you don't gain that much from moving more slowly in Way of the Hunter compared to Classic. In Classic, when I slow down to just a walk, that halves the distance at which you're spooking animals, at least from sound. And then it's, let's say it's now anywhere from 60 to 120 meters, depending on the conditions and the animal species. Well, now if you crouch walk, now that's down to anywhere from 20 to 60 meters. That's pretty close. I mean, that's getting into bow range. That's getting into, with a crossbow or a good compound bow, close bow range, well into bow range. Whereas in Way of the Hunter, 70 meters, if you're crouch walking, anywhere from 70 to 120 meters is where you're spooking animals. So in Way of the Hunter, you're spooking animals while crouching at the same distance that you spook animals while walking in the Hunter Classic. Okay, well, let's go down one step further. Let's go to prone. Let's lay down and belly crawl. In the Hunter Classic, you can belly crawl up to an animal and just about touch it. You could probably hunt with a spear in the Hunter Classic from the ground and just crawl up to animals and stab them. Legitimately. I don't think it would actually be that hard in the Hunter Classic to hunt with a spear. In Way of the Hunter, the animals are still hearing you out to 50, 60, maybe even 70 meters. I know the other day I was trying to sneak up on a Cape Buffalo, and I laid down, and I thought I'd be able to crawl, fairly close to it, but I was surprised because they kept noticing me at 70 meters, and there was a hill between me and them, a hill or a large rock. I remember there was an obstruction between me and all of the buffalo, and they're not seeing me. The wind is good, and the wind doesn't even have it functions weird in Way of the Hunter, and again, I'll talk about the other two senses later. I'm gonna make a whole video on this, but you can't crawl up to animals, or crawling serves no purpose. With the movement restrictions and the visibility restrictions that you get from laying down are not worth the gain that you get in terms of stealth. You do not gain anything from going prone in Way of the Hunter except for stability for a shooting platform with the rifles. That's the only reason I ever go prone in Way of the Hunter, as opposed to Classic, where you can actually crawl up to an animal, and it is painstakingly slow, but you can do it. Now, I think an in-between would be better, but here's the thing. Now let's compare visibility. The farthest away I've ever been seen by an animal in Way of the Hunter, probably about, I don't know, let's say maybe 100, but really I think it's about 70. I think about 70 meters if you're walking upright. It might be where or I guess not even walking, but standing. And you're standing out in the open. In Way of the Hunter, I think about 60 to 70 meters is where they will see you. But sometimes, if you crouch down, it's like it gets down to, if you're in a bush, it seems like they'll come up and just about lick your boots. Versus in the Hunter Classic, if you're upright, or if you're crouched, and you're not behind a tree, and even in Call of the Wild, if you're not in a bush, that animal at 40, 60, 80, sometimes even 100 or 120 meters out, it's going to look straight at you. And if you don't lay down quick, it's going to go. It's gone. You can't just stand out in the open and call like you can in Way of the Hunter. In Way of the Hunter, as long as you're crouched down, you can call an animal up close enough to darn near touch it. So the animals just don't have a sense of sight in Way of the Hunter. And that makes the hearing that much more annoying. Because line of sight now never matters under any circumstance. And they're just, the only way they ever sense you is from this weird radar sense that they have. And then the sense of smell doesn't even really matter, because the sense of smell in Way of the Hunter doesn't even spook animals. It just pushes them, They don't run, they don't flee. They just jog just far enough away that they can't smell you anymore. Then act like nothing ever happened. And that shouldn't be the case. They should be headed for the thickest brush that they can find so that they can be safe. In the Hunter Classic, all animals, it doesn't matter how you spook them, they spook the same. But in Way of the Hunter, for whatever reason, these animals, when they're reacting to their sense of smell, they hear, like if they hear something walking on grass through a hill 150 meters away, they bolt and they run 300 to 400 meters. But they smell a human, and they know it's a human, and they have little to no reaction, seemingly. They move, but they're not scared of it. They just get pushed 100, 150 meters until they can't smell. And then that actually ends up helping you, because now you have room to navigate and to cut an angle and to go around. Whereas you couldn't have before, because they would have heard you, or they should have seen you, but they wouldn't have seen you because all the animals are ridiculously nearsighted in this game. And deer are nearsighted in real life, but it is not anywhere to that extreme. I've been spotted by deer 250, 300 meters away in real life. It's not that uncommon, and that's walking. And then moving, if I'm not moving, if I'm not in a good spot when I'm sat down, even if I don't move, I mean, 150 meters out, they will bust you, especially a big buck. I have a very vivid memory. A good 8-point buck, he walked into a shooting lane and immediately just his head snaps straight in my direction. And I mean, I am in the thickest grapevine you can imagine with my back to a pine tree. I have no silhouette. I've got all these grapevines in front of me with just enough of a window to shoot through. And for whatever, somehow that deer just immediately picked me out. And it was crazy. You know, and in that exact spot, I had yearlings almost lick my boots. But this big buck, he picked me out immediately, so they can see you at distance. But in Way of the Hunter, their sense of sight is almost useless, and their sense of smell is okay, but it's not good enough. You know, and I know Way of the Hunter they haven't tried to market themselves as the most realistic hunting game, but that is sort of that's the crowd that it seems they've attracted. Because I've seen a lot of old names in the Steam forums for Way of the Hunter that I recognize from the forums for the Hunter Classic. A bunch of YouTubers from the Hunter Classic in the old days, they came to this game and they liked it for that feeling, because it sort of has a similar feeling to Classic when you start playing it. It has a similar learning curve, but after that learning curve, they're very different games. And the feeling that Way of the Hunter ends up giving at the end of the day, after you've gotten over that learning curve, ends up being more like Call of the Wild than Classic. And that is not good, because Way of the Hunter will never beat Call of the Wild by playing like Call of the Wild. They have to beat their own game, whether they go the most realistic route or not, and I think that they should. And a common misconception is that the most realistic game has to be the hardest, and that's not true, because as I just said, it's much easier to get close to animals in the Hunter Classic, but yet everybody calls the Hunter Classic the most realistic game, and in some cases the hardest. But that's not necessarily, those two things don't necessarily go together. You know, but that's enough of a ramble for now. I need to make a video on that, and I need to write some stuff down for that one and get my thoughts together, because this game has a ton of potential. I think this game, I feel like it has more potential than I felt like Call of the Wild had when it came out. And I had a lot of hopes for Call of the Wild that just never came to fruition. I know a lot of other people did too, and it ended up doing fine. And it's got a great player base, and a lot of people love it, and they probably made a bunch of money on it. But I think it's fallen short of being the best hunting game ever made, which there's not a lot of hunting games being made. So for a game to not take that title is sort of disappointing with, you know, either of these two games, because that's how much more modern they are than the Hunter Classic, which was made in 2009, and then even the Hunter Classic doesn't have things that games had going back into the early 2000s and even the 90s. You know, there's no seasons. There's no, I'm trying to think, there was something else. There's no rutting behavior. The animals don't fight each other, with the exception of the ibex. But even that's just sort of a random animation that happens. It doesn't have a rhyme or a reason. I remember in the old deer hunter games, you'd see a buck chasing a doe sometimes. You, I haven't seen that in a game since 2005. And why is that? Why can we not have that? Why do we just keep releasing another DLC in the middle of bumblefuck Australia? And again, I like Australia. Australia's a good place. A lot of good hunting. It belongs in a hunting game. But why are we doing that before we get the core gameplay mechanics down? Why are we doing that before we've made our animals made them act like animals instead of adding like robots that show up here at 12 o'clock and then they go and they rest at 12 o'clock or 3 o'clock and then they go in here and they eat at 5 and they go back to drink and then they go back to here. They've got a schedule and they follow it to the minute every day and they do not abandon it. Why does this herd of mule deer go to this field every day and they've got one other somewhere that they go that they decide they want to use after you shot at them a couple times? But why is it just these two fields? Look at all this green stuff right here. There's nice open field right here. What about the stuff growing at the edge of the lake? What about the acorns when they drop in the forest from the oak trees? Most of the time a deer it's his primary forage is going to be out in the open. And almost the only exception to that is in the fall, the early fall, when the acorns fall from the trees. Then it's like suddenly you went from seeing deer out in peanut fields and cotton fields all day, every day. And a lot of people think that they get out of those fields because of hunting pressure, but actually it's because they switch over to acorns after harvest. And those deer are just as active in the daytime until you get on into October and well into the firearm season. But they just swapped eating acorns, so they're back in the woods instead of out in the fields. And that's something I noticed in real life. Like, why don't we have that? Why don't we have those seasonal changes? We have the technology. We could absolutely do that. But we just keep getting another $5 DLC with, a shotgun that works kind of different than the other one, and a second recurve bow, and then a 300 Win Mag, but this one's semi-automatic. But we already had a 308 that could do the same thing to 90% of the animals. Then why isn't that time being spent making a more realistic game? And again, having rutting behavior is not going to make the game harder. It would make it 10 times more realistic. And it's not going to make it harder at all. And it will make it more exciting. It will make it more immersive. It will make it more compelling. And I think it would raise the worth of the game. I think people would be willing to pay more for that type of experience. When people get into the game and they get frustrated and they come down here and they spook the first herd of deer, and then maybe these two got spooked by these, and then they come down here and they don't see any animals and they get mad and they want more animals and blah 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 and they want it to be easier. But that's not gonna keep people if you make it easier. That's gonna satisfy them immediately, and then they're gonna come down here and they're gonna shoot everything a couple times and they're gonna be like, well, that's what the game's about, and then they're gonna forget it. But if you make seasons and you make unique animal behaviors, if you make it so you have to pay attention to what their forage is, if you make it where you have to really learn the map, like not just where the animals go, but why do they go there. You should have to learn to recognize which trees are oak trees, so that when the acorns drop in the fall, you have to go hunt those spots. Early in the spring, where's the first place the first new growth is going to come up? It's going to be in a clear cut. If there's any place that's been recently logged, like there's a spot up here somewhere that I got in mind. I can't remember exactly where it is, but somewhere in here there's a little clear cut. That's the first place where new growth is going to pop up next year, because it's soil that's been taken over by these trees, and it has had all these small plants sucking nutrients out of it. So that's where the best, most nutritious, tender new growth and shoots are going to be popping up through the ground, and you're going to see deer congregate there until some growth gets established in that area. That's some of the best time that you can get is in a clear cut right after the next year after it's been cut. But you would never know that from any of these hunting games. You know, they drink at 12 and you should follow the river, and they're just all going to be sitting at the edge of the river waiting for you to come shoot them, which is ridiculous. They shouldn't be just all lined up along the river from 12 to 3 or whatever the crap it is in both Call of the Wild and Way of the Hunter. It takes away from the hunt. The way drink zones should work, they should have a couple of specific places they can go to drink. Each animals or each herd should have a couple of different places they will go, but they should only go there. Keep the 3-hour period, but the animals should only be there for 5 to 10 minutes of that 3-hour period, just long enough to drink, and then they should go back to their rest zone or their feed zone or whatever they're doing next. And what that's going to force you to do is, instead of running down the river and spotting every animal and every herd and run and gun, all this bullcrap, now you're going to have to sit in a stand. It's going to make stands useful. Right now we got that tripod, and it is what it is. It's whatever. The only reason it's useful is because it's so extremely overpowered, and the animals will just run straight into it and headbutt it. But imagine you knew this herd had a. Imagine you saw a buck from this herd, and you saw him feeding, or let's say this herd, and you saw him feeding up here. But maybe it's tough to get him out in that feed area because it's so open, and you want to shoot him with a bow. And you know that this is one of their drink zones, so you got to set up a stand on this drink zone. Now you got to wait, and maybe he goes here, maybe he doesn't. And that doesn't sound exciting, and it's not until he shows up. And then when that deer shows up, you get this feeling, and it's a feeling like no other that you get when you're hunting. And I call it the oh shit, there he is. And that's something that the Hunter Classic had for a long time, especially when you first started playing it. That Way of the Hunter and Call of the Wild lose very quickly because of need zones, and because of the way that the need zones work. They're too predictable. You know, in the Hunter Classic, for years we were screaming for, we want the animals to be eating when they're supposed to be eating and drinking when they're supposed to be drinking. We didn't want them to have a particular coordinate where you could always find deer at this time without exception. That's not how hunting works. There's a place where they should be, and where they usually will be, but they don't just go there and stay there for the exact same amount of time every day. That's not the only place they go to eat. There's some good shoots of grass over here, there's some good grass over here. You got some acorns down here in the bottom, falling from the oak trees. So why are they just here? And especially in Call of the Wild, it's like they all just group up on the same blade of grass, and they barely move for a 4-hour period till they jog over to their next objective. And it just looks dumb. You know, imagine if you could sit over a field, instead of seeing Think about it. What's better? I set up my stand here. I know that this is a good field. I see this one herd of mule deer come in because they're programmed to do that. And they come here and they stay here 4 hours and they leave. And it happens like that every day that rolls. Or sometimes these mule deer, this is a feed zone. So these mule deer, they're close to that feed zone. You know, let's say their home is actually their rest zone. And it should be in a good protected area. And they should have 1 or 2, maybe even 3 of those that they can move around based on hunting pressure. And then you've got feed zones scattered around, which should basically be any good green grass in this time of year, in the summer. Really any soft green vegetation that's not poisonous. They'll eat just about anything, and they do eat a variety of things. And imagine they are going from feed zone to feed zone, because that's what deer do. They don't just sit on one spot. They graze, they move around, they roam. And that's what they do in the early morning hours, and most of the night, quite frankly. You should see this group of mule deer come through here, and then maybe you should see this buck come through here. And maybe it even pulls a deer from, it might every once in a while pull a deer from farther away if it's a really good spot. What should happen is all of these little fields, all these little openings, all these clearings, any spot that realistically would be a feed source should have a value assigned to it. A percentage, and that's how good it is. And that should be the chance that an animal's attracted to it at a given time. And that animal should go there, it should stay there for a somewhat random amount of time. Might be 5 minutes, or they might stay there the whole 4 hours, or they might just stay there 5 minutes and decide to move on. And then they go on, and they'll go to another feed zone that, and out of all the others and usually it'll be one of the higher value ones, but maybe they go to this usually they'll go to the big field with all the good grass, but maybe they go to this little spot somewhere back in here that's tucked in, hidden away, because there's no pressure there or whatever. And then when they come to drink, you can have your specific spot, but instead of going to that one spot and just sitting there for 4 hours waiting to be killed, they go there, they get what they need, and they leave. So you've got to be there at the time that they are there. And that should be a very short window. Because in real life, it is a very short window. They will go there, they will get a few gulps of water, and they leave. It takes at the absolute most 15 minutes. And the only reason it would take them even 15 minutes is if that deer's picking up its head in between every sip and doing a double take and doing it 3 times. To make sure something's not about to jump on its back or it's not about to get a bullet in its ass. That's the only reason he's going to take 15 minutes. Really, it should only take 5. So you could make it like that, where it feels more alive. Or you could just, leave the animals as robots and just keep adding DLC that gradually fewer and fewer people are going to buy until the game dies out. Because Call of the Wild already serves that purpose, and you will never catch up to them because they made that game, and you will not beat them at their own game. You have to make your own. If Way of the Hunter wants to survive, if it wants to grow, they have to make their own game. And the way that they did Need Zones is more or less straight out of Call of the Wild, or it's got way too much influence from it, anyway. It's kind of a hybrid between Call of the Wild and Cabela's Pro Hunts. And again, both of those were, they were cool when they came out, but that's been done, and it can be done better, and it should be done better, and there's no excuse for it not to be better. That's all I got for today. Everybody have a good night.